Welcome back to another exciting episode of Narrative Dive, where we deep dive into the stories dominating and driving our world. I'm Jessica Buchleitner, your resident journalist.
And I'm Angela Natividad, your resident mythologist.
And today we are going to be discussing birth narratives.
There's a vicar that I spoke to about a year ago who told me that he thinks of the Big Bang, for example, as a totally religious narrative. It's that classic from nothing comes something. And I would say that's one of the first stories that we're taught when we're in school. And it's the story upon which like the basis of what we think of as sort of like materialistic rationalist thinking is built. But when you think of like other birth narratives, for example, in Abrahamic narratives, God sort of speaks the world into existence. That's probably one of like the main religious stories that a lot of people hear, like one of the big creation of the world stories that people are familiar with. You have the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, which also sort of play repeated cameos throughout our culture. Um, this story is actually quite unique in mythology because, well, for a couple of reasons, actually. In a lot of oral storytelling, there's usually a birth is usually associated with a goddess. There's usually a first goddess who gives birth to yield the sort of like the creation and the fertility of the world. There's a god or goddess who has to die, and like the material of their body is what's used to kind of like create and populate the world. So one one example is in the Enuma Elish, which is the Syrian, not Syrian, the Babylonian creation myth, where you have the first goddess Tiamat, who mates, and she and her husband like produce all of these other sub gods, just like in Greek mythology, just like in a lot of mythology. And she gets really upset because they're like super noisy. And she's a snake god, which is like a theme that's probably, I think it's recurred a lot over the course of the season. Um, Snake goddesses are quite common in stories like this. And she's ultimately killed by one of her sons, Marduk, who later becomes the model. No, he doesn't become the model, but he becomes syncretized with Yahweh during the when uh when the Jews are sort of like taken over by Babylon. So yeah, so Marduk has his own separate story, but in his early creation story, he kills his mother, and it's from his mother's material, like her sort of prima material, that he creates the world and the moon and stars and the sky. And then you get a creation story that's very similar to the Genesis creation story that we read about in the Bible, for example. Interestingly, though, in the biblical story, God doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't need like a prima materia. He just sort of speaks the world into existence. And this is also a very interesting quality because it sets the precedent for how important the notion of the word will be in literary cultures. So, like, particularly in the Bible, there's this reinforcing of the word is God and the word as God and vice versa. And that's actually not only a creation, like that's not only part of our creation myth, that's part of like the value of our culture. That's why we have so many fights about like the Constitution, or like Jess will attest to this, like if you want to do any kind of academic publishing or any kind of journalism, like a statement is not really real unless you've referred to it written down specifically.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. By somebody else. Like that's where a lot of this comes from. So a lot of sort of like what we build the basis of our reality, like of our reality on, comes from birth myths.
That's a very amazing point. And there's you and I talked about before we kicked off this episode that there's many ways we could really go with this discussion. I mean, there's also cultural myths around how women give birth, but I do feel that that's more of an anthropological exploration. That could you and I take that? Maybe not. Maybe I interview an anthropologist down the road, or both of us interview an anthropologist down the road on on this area of birth myths. I do remember for the book series that I produced, interviewing a woman from Brazil who had birthed 13 of her 15 children in a hut by herself. And the narrative around that is that she had to be alone to birth these children because if other people were present, there would be spirits in the room that could infiltrate the child's life. And so I do feel that that's a subdivision of birth narratives, all of the beliefs surrounding bringing a child into this world, which I do think warrants more exploration at a later date. So we're mostly going to be focused on this episode of what the metaphorical notion of birth means. And one of the ones that I wanted to touch on was this notion of rebirth or reincarnation that is present in many religions, not necessarily Christianity per se, but it's prevalent in many world religions, that which literally means to take on the flesh again. We see this in mythology. I have actually a piece of jewelry that one of my best friends gave to me, the phoenix. I love the phoenix myth, this bird who's reborn from its own ashes, who puts all of its destroyed pieces back together to rise again. And this metaphor is incredibly powerful, this rebirth metaphor. It's so powerful, in fact, and this is a very bizarre jump, forgive me, everyone, but serial killers have used this as a way of reinstating themselves back into society in some way. So David Berkowitz, who was known as the Son of Sam, who in the 1970s walked around New York City randomly shooting people. I don't actually know his body count, but he terribly injured and killed many, many people. And after entering prison on a life sentence, he admitted that he did not act alone, but also it became a born-again Christian. So when you really think of this being born again, there is an aspect of forgiveness there. By somebody saying that they're born again, they're basically saying, I'm absolved, or I want to be absolved. Hey, society, I've realized the destruction of my ways, and I want that absolution. I want to be delivered back to what I was before so that I can have a second chance. And so the rebirth narrative, I almost feel like when you're going through the course of life, that the rebirth narrative is actually even more important than the birth narrative in many ways. How many times in our lives are we reborn into something new, or we go into a new chapter and we've shed our old skin and come into the world as some new entity or person?
To all this, we can add the topic of actual literal birth, and notably the narratives around having children. So, as women of a certain age, like also if you're a woman of a certain age, you might observe that like people are, like they become very interested in your
And you're going to have
reproduction.
children? Yeah.
Yeah, like in a way that's like cloying and annoying. Like we don't have to talk about that really. But like you kind of think it's going to go away once you have a child, but it never really does. Like people are just continuously interested in you having more children. And this is something that I think about a lot because I'm pregnant now. And there are a lot of narratives that are like when you're pregnant, you slam very quickly into what science actually knows and doesn't know, and what culture actually knows and doesn't know. You're also part of public space in a very different way. Like people will, like there's that classic, like maybe they'll stand up for you in the subway car, or they'll smile at you and like make space for you and help you with your groceries on the road, but they'll also come up to you and tell you their stories, and sometimes they're very charming, like the man at the like in the cashier line who wants to talk about like his wife's struggle breastfeeding, or like people want to guess the sex of your baby like based on how you're carrying, or sometimes they're really scary. Like a lot of people want to talk about this traumatic thing that happened to them when they were pregnant, or like, like it's typically it's coming from a good place, right? Like it's things that they wish that they knew. And it's it's a really strange place to be in because I'm sort of awash in these narratives of birth, and like there's this very strong sort of like halo around me that I can feel right now of like people people treating me really well, like I'm doing the thing that like a young woman is supposed to do, right? Like sort of like realizing her full potential. And there are some other narratives that attach to that I think about a lot, and that I think plague women who are even seduced by these stories, like this possibility that maybe I will feel really fully realized once I become a mother. Um, One of the narratives that's very tricky for women who like, who go through this process is this idea that like a maternal instinct is just going to kick in and you're going to feel a love and a sense of meaning that you've never felt. Often with my friends who've had children, that's not the case. Um, One actually put it in a very good way. She said simulating bonding is the bonding, and it's the bonding until it actually feels like bonding. One took about a year to actually feel like what she felt for her child was love. So this is like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like it's a very complicated thing, and there's like a whole rabbit hole we can go down about why this story of the maternal instinct exists. Sylvia Federici has written a lot of great material about this, about how the fantasy of this sort of like the maternal like goddess woman, it sort of emerges at the same time capitalism does, because capitalism, in order to function, needs to disenfranchise certain populations in order to improve the lot of others. And women are among the populations that it disenfranchises not only once, but over and over and over. And one way it's actually able to do that is by positioning domestic labor, like notably like childbearing, child rearing, literally like creating new workers for the capitalist system, and like shaping them and forming them, is positioning this labor as love and not labor that needs to be supported, that needs like compensation. And I'm not referring necessarily to monetary compensation. It merits mention that when Sylvia Federici and people like her started talking about maternal work as labor, there was a lot of social pushback against this, like, because it's very deep inside us, right? Like, what do you mean? Like, are you trying to say that women don't love children? Like that mothers don't love? Is that what you're saying? And
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, like as if like there's a distinction that's been made in our minds, and there has been, between what we understand to be love, like this sort of like you just give of yourself, and labor, which is a thing that you don't necessarily want to do all the time, and that requires compensation and that
Mhm.
requires resources. um so, with all of that in mind, another thing that I think about a lot is the fact that I am living while pregnant in this really nice halo, that everybody feels like they can share in as a community, of me being a woman who is pregnant and sort of like being in the midst of that beautiful story, while also knowing that once I have this child, there's going to be a really different story that kicks in. Like suddenly people are not going to feel so much in community with me anymore, not in the sense at least that they feel responsible, for example, for the education and care and safety of my child. Like they will feel in community with me in the sense that they can make judgments about what I'm doing in public space, and how I personally am responsible for every shitty thing or terrible noise that my child will make. So right now everybody wants to share in the community halo of this beautiful narrative. And this, I think, is also the time when you're really sort of like drip fed that beautiful story of like that maternal love that you're going to feel very soon, that's going to turn overwork into passion and all of that other stuff, like your delirium into something beautiful and transformative later. um because later, when your child is born, all of that sense of community in this pretty halo is going to pull back, and you're going to realize you're just alone, and all you have actually is that story, and that story has to be sufficient to sustain you, because quite often we don't have government support, there's not a lot of professional support. You have to find a way to cobble it all together on your own, and if you're lucky, you have a partner who can help you. But even in those like really lucky situations, the pressure that exists for men in relation to raising a child are just not as heavy as they are for women, which is also a hangover of like when capitalism was born. Like one of the reasons why when mercantilism became very popular, men also endorsed this idea of women no longer working, just staying at home and having children, was because, and I'm sure that you're seeing this, like that one of the complexities of capitalism is that every time there's a new market, like lots of people make a lot of money and it looks good for a while. And then like as that market solidifies, like it gets harder and harder, and
Yes.
resources and goods get more and more scarce, and services get worse and worse. Like there's actually a modern tech term for this. Like I don't know if we could call it a tech term, enshittification. Like just like things start out really great, like when they start, and then like they just get worse and worse, like Uber. um
Great
so
example. I was just thinking that actually.
yeah, yeah. So one of the issues
Yeah.
that men were having, like in the 1600s, was that they were making less and less money as merchants. And it became interesting for them, like to have somebody performing tons of unpaid labor at home so that they could spend more time outside. And that's where you also start to see the birth of these dynamics that still sort of exist today, except that through history, we've as a society become like more enshittified, such that actually both people need to be working full time constantly. Like our retirements are slowly sliding away from us. And so like it does raise this question of like, where does this beautiful birth narrative happen? Like where does this beautiful thing that's not supposed to be labor occur? Like if everybody's also supposed to be working full time, who is raising children then if a community is not responsible for them? And if both parents are responsible for sort of like sustaining the family by constantly working, like what happens to that model? And this is something that the story is not able to accommodate. And I don't know if this is like a problem that we've actually understood is something that we have to solve.
One of the biggest determinants of happiness in life or success, and of course, many people beat the odds of this, is how and where you are born and what family you're born into. And also what gender I guess you would call it gender assigned at birth now, but the body you're born into as well is a huge predictor of what narratives will surround you in the very beginning of your life. In India, for example, in some cultures, being born a female is like a curse. So there's infanticide, there's this fear of having girl children because they think, oh, now I've got to pay dowry when she marries. There's this heightened sense of responsibility around having female children, and not just in India, but in cultures in many different countries where female children are less desirable. So there's this automatic narrative of what a failure this person's going to be when they come into the world. And these narratives can haunt us, actually, depending on what social class you're born into in whatever society you live. If you live in a society that still has caste systems, if you're born in an untouchable caste, what does that say about the story of your life from your first breath, what does that say about what opportunities you will have? And again, many people can defy the odds, but what path does that really put you on from the beginning? In European cultures, there are still dynasties. One of my Italian friends likes to say Italy will never get rid of its dynasties because family names mean a lot versus you look at a country like the United States. In some circles, yes, family names mean a lot. If you're a Rockefeller, if you're a Carnegie, for example, or a Kennedy even, then you have some kind of automatic social standing or a celebrity's child. But arguably family names mean less there, and you have more social mobility apart from a family name. So what family you're born into also dictates how you're seen in the world, how you show up in the world, and what narratives surround your projected success in life as well. And the country I grew up in, that wasn't so apparent, right? And there was always a notion of you can be anything and do what you want, no matter what. But I like to think of friends of mine who were born in other countries where there are very established social orders and rankings of people. And depending on what family they were born into, and part of that structure in society determined whether they could go to a university or not, determined whether anyone saw them as intelligent even. In the anthology that I compiled, 50 Women, there's a woman named Benetta who comes from Senegal. And she talks about her mother giving her every piece of gold that she ever kept, which is basically their family's bank account, to send her to a university in the United States, and told her, go and rise up and be a leader, learn how to be a leader. For the record, Benetta did, and she's a phenomenal leader in anything she does. But the notion of being born into a family that wasn't full of female leaders already set her up with, from the time she was 0 through probably 7 years old, of this is my place in society. I can't see myself as a leader. I can't see myself as successful. I can't see myself as XYZ because of the family I was born into and the situation I was born into and the country I was born into. So that is something to also keep in mind when we talk about birth narratives, is how you're born. And I would arguably say there are many people who have defied the odds. I think it's easy for me to sit from the position I'm in and say, don't pay attention to those narratives, achieve whatever you want, because I didn't grow up in a country where those narratives were so apparent, right? So I'm in a more privileged position in that sense. And I don't think I could tell another person how to live their life based on that. But it is important to be aware that those subconscious programmings could be driving your own projected ideas of success.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say though that I think that Horatio Alger is a kind of birth narrative that's very close to the heart of the American story. Like this idea of like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and
Yeah,
like the
yeah,
man who makes himself out of nothing. Like, wouldn't you say this is also a kind of birth narrative? Like from nothing comes something, kind of.
exactly. Which loops back into the rebirth narrative
Mm.
of you were in one place and then you maybe failed at something or fell apart or crashed and burned in some way, shape, or form. And then you suddenly arose from that experience more evolved and better.
Do you want to know my favorite birth story that I heard recently?
What is it?
So it's from Indaba My Children, which is a collection of Bantu, West African mythologies. And there's an origin story that's in there. Like it's about like you have the typical, like there's a first goddess who appears, like her whole job, like she's created by like the void and the nothingness. And her whole job is to sort of populate the world, and make it, like just give it some jazz. And like,
Exactly.
yeah, but she decides that she doesn't want to. Like it's also said that like she has 3 breasts that are made of emeralds. Like she's just like she's intense. But she just stops working because she's just kind of like, I'm lonely. Like I would like a partner. So the nothingness and the void, they sort of like produce this partner for her. And it's like, it's so creepy because, you know, like she's dreaming about this. Like, is he going to be handsome? Is he going to be cute? And the void is kind of like, you know, it's creation. You get what you get, and everything is valid. I think it's like kind of their answer. And and then she hears this voice coming from outside of her cave, like, you know, like calling for her, like, my love. And she gets really excited and she just like shoots out of the top of it. And and what she sees, I will never unsee this. The creature that they made is the tree of life, but
Wow.
it's like, yeah, but he's like, you know, anthropomorphic. He's sort of like crawling along the stones like a spider. And like even the earth is like, oh, he's so gross. like with his like roots. And he's just like, he's very unpleasant, and just sort of like gnarly and horny, like in both senses. Like, and she's just like, ah, and she runs, like she's very creeped out by him. And but he's just like, no, like he's much faster than her, so he kind of like surrounds her with his branches, and what results is like, this is not like, it's the first rape basically. And so things go on like this for a while, and then the tree of life observes that like the great goddess is in a lot of pain. And initially, he thinks that she's sort of faking it to get away from him again. But then he realizes, oh, this is really serious. Like the pain is getting worse and worse. So he releases her, and she just like, she rolls around like all over the earth, like in this like grim, terrible pain for like 50 years, another 50 years, and another 50 years. Like it's terrible. Like there's just this rolling, endless pain. And finally, and the tree of life is just watching this, like he doesn't know what this is, like what is going on. And finally she gives birth, and she gives birth to the first people, like the first community of people, and they're red people. And you know, like later the story
Yeah.
will go on to tell the story of these people. But the interesting thing about this origin myth, and it's one of the reasons why like it sticks with me, is the moment that she sort of like, you know, classically like life and death join inside her, she's torn apart, she gives birth. When the tree of life sees this, he also breaks, like he bursts into green for the first time, and from the cracks of his bark come the first animals, like they just walk out of him. And I was thinking, this is something that's often missing, like even in a lot of like the oral narratives of origin of the world stories of birth of, you know, like, you know, the birth of everything from the body of a goddess. There's this little considered element of how, and I'm thinking about this too in the context of my partner, how even if the woman, like, or you know, like the sort of like the birth giving figure is sort of like literally broken open, like life and death literally meet in her body, um in that witnessing, like there's something in the man that breaks open too, like in the partner that breaks open. It's not an abstraction, you know. And I think that there are a lot of like, particularly in heterosexual relationships, there are a lot of partners that watch this. It must be strange for men, like men particularly, because it's kind of like it's a narrative experience of what's happening in a woman's body. Or actually, you know, like even in same-sex relationships, any partner who's not the partner who's carrying, it's kind of like an abstracted experience. Um, that they can only sort of take part in by sympathy, you know, but everything that they're experiencing is kind of secondhand. But in many ways, I think of like there's also something touching about this journey too, because like I feel very conscious about the fact that I'm literally over the course of this time preparing for my body to be broken open, like for that classic initiation. And then everybody takes it for granted, like I'm going to change and blah, 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 like all of these things. But when I see sort of like my partner's progression, I see that like, yeah, there's something weird happening to him too, right? Like he's also experiencing putrescence, like an evolution. And I think in some ways, even if he doesn't know it and couldn't like put it quite in words quite this way, like I think there's also a sense that he's preparing to be broken open. And I can see how there's a lot of like in heterosexual relationships specifically, like a lot of men might rail against that or get really aggressive and run away from that. And
Yes.
yeah, because it's like it's a thing that you don't know, it's a thing that you suspect is going to crush you, and it's humbling and it's designed to be. I think like creation is a really it is fundamentally a violent act.
There are feminist scholars who
Mm-hmm.
said there was one very famous one. Well, Shulamith Firestone is known
Mm-hmm.
for being highly critical of pregnancy and birth. Some of them are quite far in one direction.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would necessarily call it, I don't know, what is it, Neanderthal to give birth. And I mean, I think some of them are just so adverse to having children that they necessarily would never see it as a good thing. But Shulamith Firestone talks a lot about the fact that women can gestate and give birth has automatically put them in society inferior to men because it encourages them to become dependent on men for sustenance while they devote their full-time energies to childcare or all of the biological things like breastfeeding that go along with giving birth. And yeah, I feel like that landscape is huge in terms of feminist literature with what it
Yeah,
means
it's
to give
true.
birth. And there's many positive and negative interpretations of it, but that's one of them that sticks out to me when you mentioned that birth is considered violent in some terms.
Yeah.
Some of them have criticized it as that, like this is very savage thing, yet it's how we all exist at the same time too. So
Yeah, it's true. And savage, like the origins
yes,
of savage. Savage means wild. You know, like wild is it's what we return to. It's what we are under this veneer of civilization. And also, I don't know, like Camille Paglia says a lot about this specific topic as well. Like it is true, like birth places women in a place of dependency.
yes.
Um, and so like there's this sort of like onus, I don't know if it's an onus, but like yeah, it does create a situation where like men have historically had to produce like a kind of like protecting factor, and then what does that do and what kind of like societal extrapolations can you make? I like my general feeling is mammals, like human mammals, have the weakest young for the longest amount of time. That's pretty good indication that we are designed to do this together. Like we're designed to take care of each other. We're social creatures. Like that's how we survive. And I think that anything like any kind of like societal norm that positions this as a weakness, like that positions our need to connect to each other and the necessity to take care of each other as a weakness is the problem. It's not the fact that we are put in context where we have to take codependence is not the issue. Like I think that we're kind of like in a story as well where we think that extreme independence is the safest position to be in. But I think like as we get older and also like as social contracts begin to collapse, like beginning
Yes.
from the 80s, I think that we're realizing like this extreme independence is quite dangerous in a very different way, like unless you become extremely rich. But even the extremely rich, like they also like quite often seem quite paranoid and very nervous. So actually like there's a case to be made that interdependence and a kind of like a healthy indebtedness, like a system of like credits and debts that is like healthy is necessary to the human story. And in fact, like so much of the economic system that we've developed comes from sort of like this like sort of religious spiritual communal language. Like systems of debts and credits are not originally economic, they are actually related to what we owe each other.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. While this is not entirely a birth narrative, it's a bit on the dystopian side. The movie Gattaca that story. I had the pleasure of mentioning that movie in a piece about ectogenesis last year, which, if you don't know what that is, it's an artificial womb, and which entirely fits into birth narratives, because anytime you put the topic of an artificial womb central in a discussion, it basically brings out every negative part of society as to why the system is so broken around supporting women who have children. Yet this seems to be the narrative of all of these tech gods who claim that through this artificial womb, women will be equal, all of society's problems will go away, removing the aspect of pregnancy or outsourcing the labor of pregnancy, which we're then looking at human birth as a form of labor to be outsourced in an economic model versus just, as a human trait. What we've done in contemporary times is turned birth and the labor of birth into economics. Surrogates, right, get paid to have babies for affluent people because the act of having to give birth is very taxing on the body. But there are risks associated with pregnancy. And so the idea is, if I can farm out these risks to someone else and pay that person monetary compensation to take them on for me, I can still be a mother, but I don't have to go through the physical labor of a pregnancy and the physical labor of birth. Going back to the film Gattaca, so in the movie, the invalids were a group of people who were not genetically engineered before they were born. And so they were believed to be an inferior group compared to those who were genetically engineered. And in the movie, when the main character, played by the actor Ethan Hawke, was born, his parents decided not to genetically engineer him, but the whole narrative of his success within that society was tarnished by not being genetically engineered. So the body he was born into, the cells in his body, the sociological aspects of that in this projected society of the future already set up the fact that he could not go above being a janitor in a space travel facility. And in order to defy that narrative, which he can't escape because it's in his DNA, it's in his cells, he has to then farm out bodily material from another person. And so I think that movie is, in a dystopian sense, really exemplifies birth narratives and how they can follow you, and the narrative that you're born into can really cast a wide net in your life.
So thanks for joining us in the story of birth narratives. We hope that you learned something, that you had a good time, that maybe sometimes you laughed and maybe like occasionally touched your face and were a little freaked out. If you liked this episode, please don't hesitate to subscribe, share it with others, like it. It helps us a lot. If you could review it, that would be wonderful. We'd love to hear what contributions you could make, what you'd like to add to the story of birth narratives.
We will see you next season. We have now completed our minimum viable product of Narrative Dive, and we'll be launching reels soon on Instagram and TikTok with some shorter topics. But if you made it this far, we didn't only come this far to come this far. There is definitely more to come as we continue to evolve this experiment that we have created.